This is a stunning movie, and Jerry, you actually checked it out.
I did check it out again because I didn't want to make the mistake. You know, we did a tribute to The Missing, but I never got to watch it again in time. So
Right.
I've been trying to rectify that mistake every time.
Well, we're gonna share our thoughts when we bring up our first guest who's waiting on the line. But for the uninitiated out there, let me tell you a little bit about the film. Last Tango in Paris follows Paul, played by Marlon Brando, an American living in Paris, who begins an affair with a young Parisian woman named Jean following the suicide of his wife. Paul dictates a series of strict rules to Jean once the affair begins. They are not to know each other's names. They are only to meet in the empty, unfurnished apartment where they initially met, and they are to share no personal information about their lives outside of the cocoon of that apartment. What's left is sex, and lots of it. Jean remains open, curious, and vulnerable in her sexuality, while Paul uses sex as a means of rebellion against the aimless direction of his life and the wife who killed herself so suddenly and without explanation. The only way Paul can feel is by debasing her and himself, making her tell him the awful sexual acts she'd perform on a dying pig to prove her devotion to him, and in the film's most infamous moment, violating her anally while using butter as a lubricant. You know, I never thought that I'd use that phrase here on the show.
Well, you just did, man.
Or in any situation. Any situation, yeah. Just how controversial was Last Tango in Paris? It was released with an X rating and later classified in C-17 in 1997. Many critics slammed the film as pornography disguised as art. It was banned for nearly 30 years in Chile. In 1976, the Italian Supreme Court judged the film obscene, ordered all copies confiscated and destroyed, sentenced director Bernardo Bertolucci to a 4-month prison stay, and revoked his civil rights for 5 years. In fact, the ban on the film wasn't lifted in Italy until 1987. Co-star Maria Schneider claimed that she felt raped by Bertolucci and Brando during the shooting, and considers her participation in the film to be one of her true regrets in her life. And Brando, too, felt very violated and swore never to bare his soul so completely for another project. But how brilliant is Last Tango in Paris? 36 years after its initial release, it never loses its power to move, provoke, or to shock. Even after we've been blessed with challenging, boundary-pushing films like Cronenberg's Crash, and burdened with juvenile, titillating trash like Basic Instinct and Showgirls. Robert Altman questioned why he dare continue to make movies following a screening of the film. And Pauline Kael, in what is perhaps the most famous and influential movie review in history, said of the film that it had altered the face of an art form. It was Brando's swan song from the breathtaking, completely invested performances for which he had become legendary. And to this date, I don't think any film has been as honest and expressive about sex and how it motivates and defines character. So helping us further examine this landmark film is acclaimed critic Doug Pratt. He is the editor and publisher of the DVD Laserdisc newsletter, which has a worldwide circulation. He's been sourced or featured in periodicals like Time and Newsweek and the New York Times and Rolling Stone, and he's reviewed more than 22,000 films. And that makes me feel like quite a novice.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, yeah, once you start feeling good about yourself and the number of films that you've seen, just look at Doug Pratt.
22,000 just really puts, I'm just going to crawl back in my cave.
That puts a lot of things in perspective. His books include a large 2-volume set titled Doug Pratt's DVD, Movies, Television, Music, Arts, Adult, and More. He's terrific. We welcomed him on for McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and we are very pleased to welcome him back on for our Last Tango tribute. Doug, are you with us?
Oh, yes.
Welcome back.
Thank you so much for joining us again, my friend.
Uh-huh.
Last Tango in Paris. First of all, you've made a list of your 400 favorite movies.
Yes, I did.
I like this guy, 400. That's actually, I can narrow it down. To be honest, I could never do 100 or 200, but 400 I can work with.
Well, you narrowed it down from 22,000 to 400. I think that's great.
Impressive.
Those are the 400 that stand out. I've been tempted to expand it, but I think everything else would just be in alphabetical order after that.
Right. and McCabe was your top, but
looking
at your list, Another one of my tops, personal tops, is Last Tango, and that was on your list as well. So to start out with, why don't you give me a sense of...
Yeah. Well, I really, you kind of got to put it in personal terms. I mean, I first saw the movie. I was 18 years old. I was still in high school. I was living in Seattle, and I drove down on spring break to see it in Los Angeles because it was like the spring of 1973. It had just opened up down there, and of course it wasn't. It opened in L.A. and New York, and it probably didn't get to anywhere else in America for another 6 months or something like that, because in those days, rollouts were very, very slow. But I went and saw it immediately. It was an 18-hour drive down there. I stayed with some friends. We went to see it, and then a couple of days later, I came back up. So
because the buzz on the film.
Yeah, well, that was that was certainly the motivating factor. But when I saw it, it's almost like the sex is irrelevant in some ways. It's kind of like the music is what lingers much longer than the sex does, and the performances.
I can see that.
Yeah. And then the other thing was more recently, I don't think anybody ever really feels old unless they're actually ill, but there is a point when you don't feel young anymore, when you recognize that you're no longer young. And for me, it was when I suddenly realized that I was older than Brando's character in Last Tango in Paris. It's like all of a sudden he looks like a young guy and not some old man. So I kind of have seen the movie from both perspectives now. And so it has a very personal, it has a lot of personal meanings, but it's just a brilliantly made film. I think that it's in some ways it's about the compartmentalization of grief, and the apartments that you see in there are different parts of the hero's psyche, and he's deliberately, he pushes his mother-in-law into one room, and then you have these other, little demons or old women looking out of other rooms, seeing what's going on. He hustles them back inside of their rooms, and then this grand, upper attic room that's like the libido or what have you is where he meets the girl and but then at the same time there's also like this parallel story that's her story, where she's saying that growing old is a crime, and I think that she is grieving over the fact that she has to become an adult, and and she's contemplating marriage and responsibility and all of that, and her father is dead, and she has to accept that she's no longer a little kid, and so that they're both coping with different forms of grief and trying to deal with it. And then the film is treating that symbolically as well as dramatically, and I think that's why it's much more than just the sex film that everybody got all excited about initially. That there's a beautiful artistic underscoring to everything that is what makes it so magnificent.
Well, when I talk about the sex, it's portrayed very honestly. It's not a movie that exists to turn you on.
No, not at all.
It's there to express the state of mind of these characters, and it has been observed. You mentioned the age. It has been observed that she is very childlike, very open, curious, and in the course of the film, particularly with that ending scene, she becomes an adult at that moment, and he ends the end of the movie as a child, almost cuddled in an infant position. I'm not going to give away the ending, but for those that haven't seen it.
Oh, okay, all right.
For those that haven't seen it after 36 years and need to catch up.
Yeah, really. We're not giving away no spoilers here.
But your appreciation of it. So obviously it has deepened throughout the years.
Yes, with really good films, the more often you see them, the more details and the more they thematically support themselves, reinforce themselves. And I was noticing, because obviously I too, was just watching it yesterday to get ready for this, and I was struck in like the tango scene, which is the penultimate scene in the film, how the dancers, are very mannequin-like and very mechanical, and yet at the same time they're creating this beautiful, art. Because they're being mechanical and because they're being, mannequin-like. So that there's like this duality here where, you have to go through these rules and these, certain restrictions and that sort of thing in order to achieve something greater, that there has to be rules in society and there has to be rules in relationships and everything else in order to, achieve a greater bond and, something greater than yourself. So.
Yeah. And in terms of, let's talk a little bit about the creative talents behind the film, starting with Bertolucci. I think he probably lived in the shadow of this film for a long time. And I think he's tried to go back and kind of recapture some of that Last Tango magic with, to a lesser extent, with Stealing Beauty and actually The Dreamers. Which
The Dreamers, I would say.
Really interesting film. But where do you think this stands in the Bertolucci canon?
Well, it's certainly, The Conformist was his first big blockbuster from an artistic sense work. His films before that are all, most of them are very satisfying. But I think The Conformist is the one that really becomes a pantheon film. I think it's my favorite of all of his movies. And so and then from that perspective, then Last Tango in Paris just kind of becomes like a nice complement to the Conformist, a reinforcement of his artistry and that sort of thing. I think that, the fact that Bertolucci, he continued to grow as an artist, and I think when, 1900, was flawed, particularly in the second half, but that it was like an extremely ambitious work, and it was also highly, very, very sexual, though it got kind of trimmed down for the American release. But it had, probably more flagrant, direct sexuality than Last Tango does. But then, he achieved, he achieved his own goal of greatness by winning the Oscar for The Last Emperor, and so so that kind of like achieved it with that, and then he, I think after that he kind of settled back and started doing more personal works. I admire greatly The Sheltering Sky. I think that one is magnificent, and I also what was it, Besieged?
Besieged is good, yeah.
Yeah, it was Besieged. Was very, very good too. But it's funny because even in like his poorer films, the films that aren't very good, like Luna, there are moments that are just magnificent within them. So that he's like one of the great filmmakers of all time. And perhaps now that his career is seems to be kind of like on the downswing or towards the end, because I haven't seen him come out with much recently.
The Dreamers. Last thing, right?
I think Besieged. Yeah.
The Dreamers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, The Dreamers was after
Besieged. It was like 2003 or 2004. So.
Yeah. He could still come up with something else, but you're getting a better perspective of what the arc of his career was like and stuff, and he's a magnificent filmmaker.
He really is, and I think with The Dreamers, it's worthwhile as a companion piece to Last Tango, because it does mix, the sexuality with, strangely, a real love of cinema.
It is. It's really it's almost really a love song to the movies of that period that it takes place. It's really a beautiful poem, almost, if you will.
And then with Last Tango, you have the subplot with Maria Schneider and her fiance, who is a aspiring film director.
Right.
And many people find fault with that. They're with the film, and then it cuts to that subplot, and they lose it. What's your take on that?
I think it has kind of a meta effect to it. That it's on the one hand, it's kind of tribute to the influence that French New Wave filmmaking had on Bertolucci himself. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's very clear references both to Godard and to Truffaut, within those sequences and mm-hmm. stuff. And I was also noticing that, in quite a few of the scenes involving Leo, there's images of film itself. You get the passing train windows of mm-hmm. the subway train, or there's always like these barriers and stuff, and so he's moving the camera, shooting through barriers so that it looks like pieces of film flashing by. So I think there's a real, it's not self-referential, but I think it's kind of like standing back and saying that, this is what movies means to me, and this is part of my psyche, and then from there we're going to, investigate the psyche of these characters, and from there we're going to look at everyone's psyche and what are the dark places in all of our psyches and that sort of thing. And then it's also just reinforcing just simply the beauty of movie making, and that's what thrills me about and it's always thrilled me about the Leo sequences is just this whole thing of the beauty of movie making, of moving the camera around, and of all the silly things that he's saying. I mean, it may all be satirical or a put on, but at the same time, it's very, very true. I mean, he wants to caress Schneider with his camera, which is exactly what Godard does with every single actress he's ever had. Sure. And so you're getting that kind of tribute to it that and so I think it blends into the film very well.
Yeah, and I love the camera work all the way through, obviously, and when they meet in the apartment and the camera kind of acts like a tango. I mean, it's swaying back and forth and scanning the room, the distances between the two of them as they navigate back and forth. But the Truffaut connection, I guess it's also obvious in the casting of the fiancé, right?
Oh yes, well that's what. Yeah,
because he was made popular from his role in The 400 Blows.
Yeah, well, I mean, you almost. He's almost considered to be like a substitute for Truffaut himself.
Yeah.
But I think it's like this. It's Truffaut plus Godard. I mean, it's the combination of the two kind of different types of French New Wave and how they came about, and they took very different paths, but Bertolucci is kind of honoring both of them at the same time. And there's a whole point of why it is taking place in Paris, and the very opening scene where the two of them are walking down the long walk, and it's almost like they're entering Paris. They're going through this tunnel and they're entering Paris together, and so that at the same time, this film is just kind of like this tribute, or it's just this infatuation and romance with French movie making, and the idea of and then from there you extend to what Paris has always represented in the world of literature and the world of art and that sort of thing, and then it's being articulated here within the film, so
yeah. Well, and it's a melding of European and American. It's almost like a perfect melding of those two styles. Because in the midst of this, you have the most legendary of American actors, Marlon Brando, in your lead. What's your take on where this fits into the Brando canon?
Oh yeah, I think his performance here is it's wonderful. I don't know if I could really, rate which performance of his in which movie is the best, because almost all of them have been wonderful, from The Streetcar Named Desire up to Don Juan DeMarco. But this one, what you were saying earlier about him being exposed and raw and that sort of thing, I think he was really, he was really, experimenting with his craft here and trying out aspects of just like letting it go and really taking your own psychology and placing it on film. And I think that in someone else's hands, it might have been sillier, or it might have fallen flatter. But the fact that he was so on top of his game at that moment and still earnest about his game at that moment, that you don't get distracted by again, by the second, I mean, people are put off by the sex when they hear about it secondhand, but when you're watching the movie, it's all just very natural and very, very real in a lot of ways, and I don't ever think there's a false note in what he's doing, even though it's a very gutsy performance. It's out there, and he's allowed to take risks, and I think. Yeah. That Bertolucci and the editing and the cinematography is helping him in that, because they're never really, they never abandon him. They always support him, and he is just like trusting them and letting go with himself and really letting it go. And maybe he was embarrassed afterwards because of how much he exposed himself, but for the sake of future viewers from now until eternity, thank goodness he did, because it's a wonderful experience to see him work his craft.
It's stunning, and we're going to play the entire scene at the end of our next interview. But the scene where he's talking to his dead wife.
Yeah.
That just shatters me more than any scene I've ever viewed. That's such a moment of complete honesty, and only he could do that in that manner, I think.
Right.
Because I think Roger Ebert was the one that brought it up, that while he's cursing his dead wife, at the same time that he's expressing his love for her in the only way that he knows how at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the major turning point in the film, because then after that, then the relationship between them starts to really fall apart and stuff, and you're heading towards the end of the movie after that. So it's truly the center of the film.
And the Francis Bacon references. The film opens with two portraits of Francis Bacon, a man and a woman, very discombobulated, bloated figures, as Francis Bacon style. How does that speak to those characters, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's reinforced, of course, by all those wonderful shots of people through the oblique glass. Through the oblique windows and things like that. I really can't tell you enough about Bacon's own themes to speak to how, what it's reinforcing within the film, other than, like I say, that on one level, this movie works on so many different ways and so many different levels, but on one level it's clearly about an exploration of the psyche, and obviously Bacon's paintings are that same kind of expression. So that here, you get in the scenes and the drama what you're getting in Bacon's canvases.
That kind of distortion, and the figures behind the glass too. That does have the same effect. And there's shots in there where you see Brando curled on the floor in an odd position, where he reflects some of those images of Bacon as well.
Yes.
And I want to ask you about another critic, and it really is just one of those watershed reviews, Pauline Kael's take on Last Tango.
Right. Well, she compared it to the reaction to Rites of Spring.
Yeah.
And I think that certainly holds true. Perhaps the film. Rites of Spring eventually became a mainstream piece that you hear all the time on the local classical station, and Last Tango in Paris is now a traditional semi-foreign film that you can go and rent at the local Blockbuster if you want, and so in some ways, it certainly threw critics for a loop when it first came out. I don't know if, Rites of Spring and what Stravinsky was doing signified an entirely new approach to music, and I think that's more of what Godard was doing in his early films. I don't think that this film, set that was the starting point for that kind of movement the way that Rites of Spring was, but it certainly validated that the possibilities of film were much greater than what people had thought up to that point. French New Wave filmmaking may have been because they're always saying that there's nothing original in movies anymore, and French New Wave filmmaking may have been the last original thing the movies came up with. And Bertolucci in making this film was digesting and expressing everything that he had picked up from the new wave and learned from the new wave, and he was kind of like one of the first of the post new wave generation of filmmakers to come out and to accept that. So in that sense, the fact that he was legitimizing it and bringing it into the mainstream more so than those films themselves had done. You could say that in that sense it was like Rites of Spring.
Right. But this review that she wrote is probably the most ecstatic review. I mean, I can think of Nashville was a pretty big rave as well. But they even ran the full thing on the 2-page ad for Tango.
They ran a lot of her reviews in full on ads when she
wrote about Brando, though. I mean, if you go back and read any of her reviews of Brando's movies, I mean, she, especially for The Godfather, I mean, she loved Brando. I mean, she really loved him.
She recognized great film acting. I mean, there's no two ways around it.
A couple of years, 20 years ago, I remember reading one of the review for The Godfather. I was reading, and I just and then I read a couple of others of Brando, and she just really picked up on something in Brando, and just really, I mean, she wasn't the kind of person that would give anyone.
Well, yeah, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but she was a very she was a very emotional critic. She relied on her emotions, and sometimes she would review a movie depending upon how she was feeling at that moment, and so a so-so movie would get a good or a bad review just depending upon what mood she was in. But she relied upon her emotions and used her emotions in her writing, and that's one of the major hallmarks of her writing, and what baffles everybody about it, because everybody tries to look for scientific analysis of what she saw in films and this and that, and she was reacting to them emotionally, which is how you react to film, and
she had it right. I mean,
and of course her magnificent skill was to be able to transfer that, to transfer her emotional responses to the film, to the written page, and then also to reinforce it with a knowledgeable analysis of the artistry that was at work.
Yeah, and apparently she claims she never saw the same movie twice. I mean, she wouldn't go back and watch Last Tango. That experience was so embedded in her mind, she didn't want to soil it somehow.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know about that. If I see a movie that I really, really like, of course I'm going to want to go back and re-experience that again and again.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
But, I
make sure I like it, make sure it holds up the second and third time.
Us indulgent American something or other. But you see something you like, you're just going to keep on doing it until you're stuffed.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you put it aside for a couple months, and then you come back and you start watching it some more.
Right.
Right. And with any great movies, as you said, it deepens in meaning over time. When you have more life under your belt, you see new things. Mm-hmm. And this movie is definitely like that for me. In terms of the film's legacy and influence, where do you see that?
Well, I think that Brando's presence in it is I think probably its primary legacy. Because it is one of his major performances, and in that sense, it was innovative, because I don't think there really is another performance that you can really find that's quite like that. That's both as daring and yet as technically accomplished as what he did there. I mean, but then as we were also speaking about, it's one of Bernardo Bertolucci's major films, and Bernardo Bertolucci is one of the great filmmakers of all time. So. Mm-hmm. So this stands high there. And then just as its own, as a piece of art, I mean, the fact that the cinematography is so beautiful, the music is so haunting, and that there are 3 or 4 different storylines all mixing together in this that, really makes it enduring. And the other thing, the history of movies has like this long history of actresses, showing up for 1 or 2 movies and then disappearing altogether. Mm-hmm, and Maria Schneider was in 2 greatly significant films of the early 70s. She was in this and she was in The Passenger. And and she may have done like nothing else other than that, but because she was in those two movies, I mean, her legacy as one of the great iconic film actresses of the 20th century, will always be there because of her appearance in just those two films, and the fact that she did a good job in both of them. I mean, it's in a lot of ways it's like a thankless part because she's being manipulated by the men in the film, she's being manipulated by the directors outside of the film. I mean, she's there just as the token pretty girl, but at the same time there's depth and meaning to what she's doing, and she's working hard at it, and she's trying to figure out what the hell everybody wants from her, both as her character and as an actress, and yet she holds her own. So, I mean, she earned her chops, and even though, she disappeared shortly afterwards, I mean, she will remain in the history of film, because of her appearances here.
Yeah, well, I mean, Marlon and Jack. I mean, those are going to be your leading men, the two women. You can't really do much better than that. I mean,
she is very interesting too because she's still around, and I think the last interview she did was a couple of years ago where she talked about Tango and how it was a great regret in her life and how her favorite performance is The Passenger. And her claim of kind of trickery on Bertolucci's part particularly, which he refutes. So it's very interesting to go back and watch the movie and then read these accounts of the shooting of the film. But Doug, we appreciate your participation in the show so much. What are some of your other favorite movies that you would like to come on and discuss in the future?
I mean, we're going to do the Doug Pratt Presents, basically.
What are the other 398 movies?
300. Well, I mean, your focus is on movies from the 70s, right?
So we've gone back to Gone with the Wind.
We go back. So just name a movie. Just pick a movie.
I'd love to do Orpheus or Juliet of the Spirits or Sunrise or 2001. I'd love to do The Garden of the Finzi Contini.
All these you're hitting right up my alley so far. So
Picnic at Hanging Rock.
Yeah, we just mentioned that earlier in the email.
Eyes Wide Shut. I mean,
we've done Eyes Wide Shut. Yeah.
Oh, you've done Eyes Wide Shut without me? Oh, I'm heartbroken.
We'll bring you back and we'll do an Eyes Wide Shut.
Picnic and Hanging Rock. I think we should do Picnic and Hanging Rock. That's my vote.
Well, let's make a date. Let's bring you back. Whatever we talk about, I'm sure it'll be exceptional. Yeah. But Doug, thank you so much for taking your time out tonight.
It was my pleasure. It's a movie that's worth it.
Thank you so much, Doug. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye. Okay, we also spoke about Last Tango with biographer Stefan Kanfer. And this is a great conversation here. Stefan Kanfer is an acclaimed author. He's an essayist and a critic, and his unique and stirring insights on a variety of political and cultural topics is never short of invaluable. He's a veteran writer of many of the major periodicals, including Time magazine, where he served as their first bylined film critic. And his books include two highly praised biographies on the comic genius Groucho Marx and the revelatory biography titled Somebody, The Reckless Life and Remarkable Career of Marlon Brando, which you can purchase right here on our homepage. And in this conversation, we discussed with Stefan the madness and the genius of Brando and how that all culminated into his unforgettable performance in Last Tango in Paris. And on the other side of this interview, Jerry, you and I will have some closing remarks about the film. And I just want to warn everyone, I'm doing this lately because I want to be as kid-friendly as possible. There is some harsh language because we play some clips from the film on here to give you a sense of what we're discussing. Here's Stefan Kanfer. You've written a fantastic book about Marlon Brando, and I'm wondering, since there are several biographies of him out there, what was your unique take? Why did you feel the need to write it?
I say so in the book. It's always something bothered me about Marlon Brando, who could be so wonderful, but who made so many bad movies en route. He started off extremely well with 5 really brilliant performances, or indelible ones anyway. And then, marched through the desert with a lot of second-rate movies until he came out with The Godfather and Last Tango. And I realized in investigating him and talking to people like Elaine Stritch, who were in acting school with him, and with his family and I realized that he truly was mentally ill all his life. That's the kind of rosebud that I feel that I have uncovered about him, and that given his terrible liabilities and his awful childhood, with alcoholic parents and a brutal father and a very, very embarrassingly alcoholic mother and so on, that it's amazing he got as many good things done as he did. Not that he made bad films, but that he was able to transcend so much in a Hollywood that was collapsing around him. I mean, if I had to do his life all over again, I would have ordered him to go to Italy, the way Clint Eastwood did, and learn how to make movies, and then he would have come back and been another kind of star. But it wasn't in him to do that, so he was just a genius on his own acting level.
Do you find that people that brilliant, a lot of them are in some way deeply troubled?
Oh, I think there's no question about it. I've done books on, for example, people like Groucho Marx, who was extremely funny, maybe the funniest man of his era, who you could never find any happiness with a woman, and whose home life was very, very difficult. And Lucille Ball, who was very sunny and extremely funny in her own way, but who couldn't really find happiness in her marriage, and waited to have kids until she was over 40. Right. And they were really cute and wonderful when they were little, and it was very difficult for her to be a mother later on. So there are difficulties. I think genius always comes with a price.
Yeah. But isn't, not to be so selfish in regards to them, but isn't it that damage that makes them what they are, their talent, that leaves their genius on us?
Probably so. I mean, there are always happy people, like Wordsworth, William Wordsworth. There are, not everybody has to be miserable and pressing their noses against the glass with their matches in the snow. It's always got to happen that way. But for the most part, yes, I think people look at the ledger, and the rewards are on one side and the price is on the other, and they don't want to see that price, but they end up paying for everything. Yeah, sometimes a troubled or a manic film production produces, a great classic film, whereas, a film production that has no, how should we say it, nothing happens, nothing bad happens, is bland and forgettable. Well, you're quite right. Betty Davis once told me that she said she knew when she worked for William Wyler that she would have a nervous breakdown, but that she would also get an Academy Award. She was willing to pay that price. And I think actors are generally, the smart ones, are like that. They either will suffer knowing that they'll get something good out of it, or they just can't help themselves. Brando could not help himself. He just was a sufferer.
Well, he's so fascinating, and especially since the attitude he took in the latter part of his life towards his profession that had made him what he was, compared to when he started. I'm wondering where his art came from. What drew him to acting?
Well, he always said that he went from lily pad to lily pad, which was his way of saying I didn't work very hard for it, but of course he did. He was very lucky early on. I think that his early breaks were such that he finally understood that this was the only profession he could ever have. I mean, his father was a salesman. He tried to be an officer in military school, but he couldn't conform to anything. And because he's in rebellion against his brutal father all of his life, well, who's the father figure on a movie set? It's the director, of course. So it was always a wrestling match. If you get somebody like Kazan, who was very strong and a con man besides, you could get some really quite wonderful and moving performances like Waterfront. The other directors had a hell of a time with him. It wasn't really... Yeah, Kazan was probably the best director for Brando early on.
The only one who could control him. He could
control him, and he could control the script, and he also could convince Brando that what he wanted to do was start soft and not yell all the time and not mumble, and and also convinced him finally that he could do Shakespeare, and when he did Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, you saw an entirely different Brando. It wasn't a mumbler, and it wasn't an actor studio attitude. It really was a man who cared a lot about language. Right. But he was terrified about doing theater. So when John Gielgud, who was in that production as Cassius, said, come to England and work with my company, and by the end you'll be doing Hamlet. And God, that would have been terrific to see Brando doing Hamlet. But he was afraid of going back to the theater where he started.
Excuse me, would you be willing to draw, and you might have already done this, draw parallels between his career and Orson Welles, that the genius struck very early?
Well, one understands that, except that Welles really was a protean figure who liked to direct, liked to act, I think he's like Chaplin, wanted to paint the sets, he wanted to do everything. It would not be Marlon's idea to put a ceiling in a set, the way Orson Welles said for Citizen Kane, we're going to have ceilings. And nobody's ever had a ceiling before. You just shot the thing on the set.
Right.
That sort of thing. I don't think that's where his creation was. I think there was just a lot of wounds that came out. No one had ever seen this before. The other thing that Brando did, no one had done before, and that is to throw away the script, know where you're going, basically, but reach for those words, because he said, if you know the script too well, it's like reading Mary Had a Little Lamb. He wanted to be of the moment. Now you see it all over the place. You see De Niro and Pacino and Dustin Hoffman and many other people doing it, and Gene Hackman and so on. But in those days, when we're talking the early 50s, nobody did that. And
right.
Also, he, when he was in his first movie, it was called The Men, and he played a paraplegic veteran. And he went and lived with paraplegics for 3 weeks. And so he wasn't just faking it. He actually slept with these guys. He tried to get into a wheelchair without using his legs. And, of course, it's a non-sexual life that this guy leads, though he's very male.
Right.
And he really played it to a point where, even though the movie is hard to see now, I mean, you can't find it much. It's rarely played on television. It's really a powerhouse performance when you consider it the first one. And also, there's a story I tell in there, which, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell, because it's the other side of Brando, the funny side.
Please.
And that is when he used to go. They all the vets, all the paraplegics, went to a favorite bar in their wheelchairs, and Marlon insisted on accompanying him in his wheelchair. And they went there, and they were sitting around drinking, and a woman came in, and one of those holy rollers came in and said, "Look, I know I can cure you. I can cure you. God wants to cure you. All you have to do is believe." And she went on like this, and Marlon said, "I do believe. I do believe." And he started to struggle out of the wheelchair, and the waiters came. They were so convinced that he was also paraplegic. They hadn't been told about this, that they were on either side hoping that they could keep his balance. And he got up and he walked up, and then he started to dance on the bar. The woman ran out screaming. This is the sort of thing he would do. He was a great practical joker.
Yeah. So he started off real strong, as you mentioned, and then he kind of fell into a lot of bad roles throughout the 60s and so forth. And obviously his big comeback was The Godfather, followed by Tango. But The Godfather, to me, obviously a brilliant performance, but it seemed like he put on, and he would never admit to this, he put on a mask of sorts for The Godfather, and he was so emotionally naked in Tango.
You're right, but that's the wondrous part of this talent. I mean, if you see those movies side by side, and of course I have, and even when I talk about Brando, I use a 5-minute clip of each one. You can't believe it's the same man. I mean, The Godfather is probably in his 80s. We're not certain. It's never specified, but certainly he's an old guy.
Right.
Then you look at the sexy 47-year-old that was made after Last Tango. I mean, here is Paul, really a virile, interesting man. And it's just very hard to believe that one actor could embrace both these things. It's like Mozart writing the Magic Flute and the Requiem. It's hard to believe that one mind can do that.
Yeah. What drew him to Tango, do you think?
I think he really had something in him that he had to say. He'd always been euphemizing his childhood, never wanting to confront it directly. I mean, he would confront his father directly, even put his father to work on his company called Pennybaker so that he could humiliate the old man. But he had never really talked about his childhood in that way. And this sexual framework, which is, with I think not a very talented young woman that he's working with, really the camera is all on Marlon. It's just it's his show. And in it, there's a couple of moments. One moment when he talks about how his father made him milk the cow even though he was going to a dance, and he would get, a fertilizer, let us say, on his shoes and all that. And a friend later on saw the movie and said, "Marlon, you could have always gone back and changed your shoes or washed yourself." I think Pauline Kael a little deranged in her praising.
Yeah,
a little deranged in general, but that's why we loved her. But
well, no, she's a very readable woman. I knew her quite well. We were on the National Society of Film Critics together. But when she said, it's like Sacre de Printemps, and movies will never be the same afterward.
Right.
Movies are exactly the same afterward. You need Brando to make it work. If there were Brando you could find on every street corner, fine. But that is not the case. It's a very unique performance, and one which, even though it's a confessional and an autobiographical performance, is nonetheless fiction. And so it's a real acting job. It isn't simply a guy saying, "This was my life." It's not that simple.
Sure. I do find, though, that it is the most, and I've always said this, the most honest movie about sex. Sex is used in a way in this film where it absolutely 100% represents character.
You're right, and I think that is also the way Brando was, to his discredit. I mean, here's a guy with 11 children, never related to any of them. As you know, one of them died, and his girlfriend said he died of too much living, and the daughter committed suicide, and that son Christian had killed the daughter's lover. It's a really terrible, tragic, awful life, because I think the sexuality was without responsibility. That's all very well in a film. It's not so great over the course of 30 or 40 or 50 years of fathering children and never really finding a woman that was right for him and abandoning them because he was afraid they'd abandon him if he waited too long. That sort of thing, you know. That's the tragedy, but the tragedy played out in Last Tango. It is a tragedy. I mean, not just the end, but the whole idea of this man having an inability to shuck off his childhood. He just can't.
Right.
Can't get rid of it. It's like something that sticks with him, like, you know, the shirt of Nessus, and he just can't get rid of the bloodstains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now there was. I'm sorry, Jerry. Go ahead.
I just want to know, because we're talking about his relationship with directors. What was his relationship with Bertolucci like during the making of this film?
Well, they went back and forth. You know, Maria Schneider always felt that Bertolucci was in love with Marlon. I mean, she's a very malicious woman, but she might have been right there. So it was back and forth. He was not Bertolucci's first choice. He wanted the Trintignant, and Trintignant said, "I won't appear naked on camera. I'm just not going to do that."
Right.
And I think, and then Alain Delon, he wanted him, would have been disastrous, but he wanted Alain Delon, but Delon wanted to produce it. So he said, no. So he finally got a hold of Marlon. I think it wasn't as contentious as some of the directorial battles that he had, but it wasn't exactly a happy set.
Okay.
It was just that Bertolucci is a wonderful filmmaker, and he has a great way of giving you that kind of Francis Bacon lighting and some of the subtext of horror. And I think Brando knew he was in the presence of a real talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the camera work in that film just
it's one that I don't know any other film like it. I cannot compare that. That is a film that's sui generis. I really don't know any other film that comes close to its look and its presentation. You know, because Bertolucci did have that wonderful eye.
Yeah, and it's an interesting project in terms of Brando, because it seems that post-Tango, that's when he really gave up. I think, am I correct in thinking that he felt like he gave everything he had and it wasn't worth going through that process?
He said that. He couldn't ever do it again. And I think what happened, it's not a question of giving up. I think what he did was say, okay, it's only money. You know, he was always running down the acting profession. And saying there's no such thing as an artistic actor. It's just a racket. You know, all these things that he would do. Because I think he always believed he was garbage. I mean, his father said he was garbage, and even when he got recognized and got the money, he never really, really believed that he was an artist. And that was not just a put-on. He was like that. So I think after that, he decided, the hell with it, it's money that counts. And he would make, you know, films like Superman, for example, you know, $1 million.
Yeah, sure.
Not very good, and other films that I think generally were done strictly for a paycheck.
Yeah, one film that still hasn't even been released, the Johnny Depp one, The Brave.
Yeah, well, those of us who've seen little outtakes are just as happy as him.
Okay, I'll take your word for that. That's not the first time I've heard that, but
well, you know, anything is of historical interest. But you know, if you look over the oeuvre, you know, you look at, say, the first films, The Men, Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, Julius Caesar, The Wild One, On the Waterfront. I mean, nobody has ever started a career like that. Nobody. Yeah. And then there come things like Tea House of the August Moon, which he plays an Asian and should never have done that, you know. So the last of the white guys to play an Asian, that'll never happen again. And then there were things that kind of okay, like The Young Lions, but he was always having problems with Montgomery Clift, because the two of them, like two racehorses.
Well, then, like, that was his competition.
Yeah, and then, you know, it was said that, you know, Patty Bosworth did a terrific biography of Montgomery Clift, and in the course of it, somebody says his was the longest suicide in Hollywood. And I think that probably Marlon's was. I think certainly he didn't wind up dead at 47. I think Cliff was an old man at 47, the misuse of drugs, and he had been in a horrific automobile accident, and Elizabeth Taylor's place and all that. So that didn't happen to Marlon, but it was a kind of slow-mo suicide with, things like...
Can I ask you my holy grail question then? Is it true, and I've heard this before from a lot of people over the decades, but is it true that if James Dean had not died, that would have forced Marlon might not have made those horrible choices, those films in the 60s, and it would have forced him to really stay on his game because he was the ultimate competition at the time?
Well, James Dean worshipped Brando, and Brando was quite jealous because Kazan had this new guy,
right,
and was directing him, and but Dean used to really do the kind of stuff that Marlon would come with the torn T-shirt and the jeans, which nobody did in those days, and he really aped him so much, and he used to call him at night, and Brando would pick up the phone, and he knew who it was, but he would never answer. Right. So I think there was a certain professional jealousy there, and probably had Dean lived, Marlon wouldn't have been able to get away with what he said about James Dean. He said he's using my last year's clothes and my last year's talent. And I don't think he would have been able to do that because Dean really was quite a different kind of performer, younger, and I think would have. Yes, it's like when the Herald Tribune was around, it made the New York Times a better paper. It's not good to have just one horse in the race.
Right.
And after Montgomery Clift died, and he was a sensitive, indelible figure on screen.
Right.
And James Dean was killed himself. After that, Marlon, it's true that he was alone, and he needed a goad, and most of the directors weren't strong enough to provide that.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes of recording time left. Where do you think Last Tango stands in his legacy?
I think it stands very high in his legacy because it'll tell us a lot more about an artist than we would otherwise ever have known. I mean, he says things about himself that I, as an outsider, can only guess at. There it is in documentary form, although with a powerful aesthetic around it. I'm not sure that Pauline said it would really be one of these things changed movies, and I think those are just extravagances that hurt the film rather than helped it. If you see it now, what is it now? 73, 83, 93...
26 years.
36
years. Yeah.
36. If you see it now, it's as fresh as the day it was made.
It is.
That's something.
It really is.
Tell me another
last
film
night
you
again
said about
yeah.
I mean, the others are dated. Waterfront is dated. It's a wonderful movie, but it's dated. And Last Tango is not dated. So I think you can say about it that if it's fresh 36 years later, it's going to be fresh, 96 years later. That film will always be with us. It was misunderstood at first, and I think overpraised. Now you can see it for what it is, really a fine piece of work and something that defines an actor at the other side of his career.